Hello, and welcome to the Vandenberg Coalition and the American Conservation Coalition's event, Energy Security as National Security, Reducing Dependence on Foreign Adversaries for American Energy. For those who don't know me, my name is Carrie Filipetti, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition. The goal of the coalition is fairly simple. It's to educate policymakers and the public on the importance of a strong and proud foreign policy that defends American interests, stops wars before they start, and wins wars after they begin. Our goal is to highlight the important role foreign retreat and weakness plays in undermining our security and prosperity here at home. Perhaps nothing highlights this nexus between the foreign and the domestic policy quite as clearly as U.S. energy security policy. Cheap, abundant energy is vital to modern life, and even those countries seeking to decarbonize will require oil and gas in the production of more renewable energy, like electricity, at least for the next few decades. Europe has been learning this lesson firsthand, as its decision to trade energy security for radical green transitions has increased its dependence on a rogue regime in Russia, hamstringing its response to Putin's war crimes, and causing such spikes in energy prices that everyday Europeans can no longer afford to power their homes. At the same time, however, as China builds its leadership in renewables like wind, solar, and electricity, countries are increasingly turning to Chinese products and services, threatening a long-term global dependence on China. While the problem is obvious, so is the solution. Energy security, national security, and environmental needs are all pointing us in the same policy direction. Solutions that we are proud that our Vandenberg Coalition Advisory Board members, Matt Pottinger, Lolita Jackson, and Wells Griffiths will share today. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us in this important conversation, as well as the American Conservation Coalition, which is our partner and co-host in this event, not only for their work on this program, but also for their years-long dedication to mobilizing Americans around environmental action through common sense, market-based, and limited government ideals. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Quill Robinson, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the American Conservation Coalition, to share more details on their work and to kick off this important panel discussion.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Quill Robinson, and I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for the American Conservation Coalition. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ACC, we were founded back in 2017 with the mission of giving young conservatives, young people on the right of center, a voice on environmental issues. And so at that time, we realized that for young people who identified on the right side of the aisle, and honestly for a big part of the American public, climate policy and environmental policy felt inaccessible, and it felt like their voices were not being heard in this conversation. And yet we realized that the climate change in the 21st century was going to be one of the defining issues and was one of the greatest reasons that young Americans were getting involved in politics. And so over the last 5 years, we've worked to build a grassroots advocacy network across the United States to advocate for market-based, limited government, common sense solutions to climate change and other environmental issues that we face. We now work in over 70 different communities across the country, holding activism events and educating our members about these sorts of common sense environmental solutions. And so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today because, as Carrie pointed out, we are certainly seeing the negative effects of bad climate policy, of poorly designed climate policy in Europe and other places around the world. And I think it really highlights the fact that as we are working to grapple with climate change, which will certainly be one of the defining security challenges of the 21st century, we also need to keep in mind the threat of poorly designed climate policy. And so with that, I'll turn over to Chris in just a second, but in case you're interested in finding out any more about the American Conservation Coalition, I would encourage you to go to acc.eco and learn more about how you can get involved with our movement and hear a bit more about our approach to climate change. So with that, I'll turn it over to our National Policy Director, Chris Barnard.
Cool. Thank you, Carrie and Quill, for the excellent introductions. And this is certainly a very topical discussion. And one of the problems of having such an excellent roster of panelists is that they're very busy people, and sometimes it takes a few reschedulings to get everyone to be able to do this at the same time. And we actually had this idea for this panel a few months ago, really, when this was starting to become an issue. And the fact that it's still an issue just vindicates how important it is to talk about this today. As Quill mentioned, I'm the policy director for ACC. My name's Chris Barnard, and it's my honor to be moderating today's panel discussion. Given the overlapping topics of today's discussion, we thought we would assemble a variety of experts. We have an energy expert, a national security expert, and also a climate change expert. And so to that end, we have Wells Griffith, Matt Pottinger, and Lolita Jackson joining us today. In terms of a run of show, I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists, then we'll launch straight into the discussion, and we'll end with a 10-minute or so Q&A, so please start putting your questions into the chat. Wells Griffith is the former Senior Director for Energy and Environment at the National Security Council, as well as Managing Director and Senior Advisor for Energy in the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Matt Pottinger is the former Deputy National Security Advisor, Senior Director at the National Security Council for Asia, and former reporter in China for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. And then last but definitely not least, we have Lolita Jackson. She's the Executive Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities for Sustainable Development Capital, LLP, a billion-dollar private equity firm that invests in clean energy projects around the world. She previously worked for the New York City Mayor's Office, including serving as Special Advisor for Climate Policy and Programs. So let's start with a very brief introduction from each of the panelists, just kind of talking about what you're doing right now on these issues and how you're involved in this general discussion. And let's start with you, Matt.
Sure. So, hey, it's great to be with you. So, you know, it sounds like you can find in any newspaper today a lot of different headlines that are pointing to this question of energy security, right? And if you look at the Ukraine situation right now, you've got you've got European dependency on Russian oil and gas, which has become a major factor in whether or not the West can hold together the sanctions that we've imposed. Are we going to be able to sustain those sanctions in the face of rising prices for heating oil, for example, as the colder months approach in Western Europe? You can see examples of it in terms of Taiwan, where Beijing is increasingly threatening a war to annex Taiwan. You've just seen earlier, or just a few weeks ago, a dress rehearsal for a blockade. Energy security is going to factor in a very important way there, since Taiwan is heavily dependent on imports of natural gas and other inputs in order to keep its own economy powered, an economy that runs and produces most of the advanced semiconductors for the entire world, which account for a huge percentage of just the US economy alone. Japan is in the news today because there's sort of a back and forth about whether or not Japan is going to be embracing a non-nuclear future, as a lot of people have pushed for in Japan following the Fukushima crisis that occurred after the earthquake and tsunami in March of 2011. So yeah, we thought that you know, energy security was a 20th century problem. It's very acutely a 21st century problem that we're dealing with right now.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for joining us. Wells, let's go to you and then end up with Lolita. So you're got to unmute, Matt. Wells.
It's not a webinar if you don't have that happen at least once, right? Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Carrie, Quill, and great to be with you all, Matt and Lolita. Yeah, just to follow on with what Matt said, I mean, energy security is a problem that we're having today. It's a problem we've had yesterday, and it's the problem we're gonna have tomorrow for every nation. It underpins economic prosperity, growth, and their ability to power our defense and our economies. Energy security itself is important to every nation. U.S. has been since the 70s, really, if you go back through history, Arab oil embargo, Iranian Revolution, have taken great steps to develop the Department of Energy, or establish the Department of Energy, invested in all energy sources, technologies, efficiencies that put us on a pathway to energy independence, which strengthens our own economic security as well as our national security and that of our allies. And I think it's unfortunate what's happening today. And we will, I think I guess we'll talk more about this as we go, the policies that can be pursued and activities to balance both energy security and climate priorities for the US and the rest of the world.
Awesome. Thank you, Wells. Lolita?
I'll be very brief so we can dig right into the panel discussion, but I did want to add that I'm in the unique nexus of having been in the private sector for half my career, 15 years. I worked for Morgan Stanley for 12 years prior to going to government service and working for the government. And I recognize that a lot of people are used to going to the public sector for solutions. A country like Scotland that spends 62% of the infrastructure for climate. That's unsustainable because the finances of a lot of these cities and states and localities can't support that. So the private sector has to be let in. So I'm recognizing that there's a unique role for companies to play in this climate transition for nations, for cities, for regions, and for states. And I would like to talk a little bit about that, and also just what a threat it really is, as Matt and Wells are both saying. If we don't get our acts together, we're going to be way left behind. We're already behind some countries in Europe and other localities. So we'll talk more about that.
Cool. Well, thank you to all three of you for joining us. And it really is this nexus of climate change, national security, and energy security that is the basis for this discussion that we're having today. But let's start by setting the stage here. Wells, you work both at the Department of Energy and then directly inside the White House, focusing on U.S. foreign energy policy. You talked a little bit about this in your introduction, but could you just define for us what energy security is, and just give us a little context with regards to the current situation in Europe?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So there's not a universally accepted definition of energy security. I think in the simplest form, the way it was defined when we were working in government, it's access to affordable, reliable, and secure energy. It doesn't matter if that's imported, produced or manufactured domestically, the source, the fuel. It's really that when you turn the lights, when you flip the light switch, the power comes on to fuel your economic prosperity and growth, as well as your defense and national security. Energy itself, I guess I could talk about it. It is the most important thing for the economy operating. The price of energy, we're seeing that in Europe now. The effects on manufacturing and ability to respond to foreign policy decisions as well. Really highlighted, I think, for American people, at least for me, I like the history of I'm a history major, if you will. Arab oil embargo, the 70s was eye-opening for the American people. Rationing gas, the economic impacts of that led to the Department of Energy and a real bipartisan approach, not just in the United States, but across the world with the major economies, where we began working together on developing innovative technologies, solar panels, wind, improving energy efficiency, developing civil nuclear reactors, even more so than at the time, and which we're really seeing the results now as small modular and advanced reactors are beginning to be licensed and deployed here in the near future. Created the International Energy Agency, where we coordinated with our allies on stock holdings to allow to a emergency disruption, largely for geopolitical reasons. At the same time, or not at the same time, through that process, in the early 2000s, through the Department of Energy and the labs, we unlocked fracking technology that put the United States on not just a reduced reliance on foreign countries for their energy needs, but on a path to energy independence, which was, during the last administration, Trump administration, enabled us to make foreign policy decisions that in the 70s would not have been possible. Sanctioning Iran oil, sanctioning Venezuela oil, while keeping gas prices at record lows, and having no impact on the global markets. Something that wouldn't have been dreamed of in the 70s. As well as the increased penetration and deployment of renewables and these technologies around the world and in the US. On top of that, the U.S. reduced emissions led the world in reducing carbon-related emissions from 2005 to 2017. So really, we were just in this energy renaissance, as we called it. Obviously, there's been factors since COVID, and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a change in domestic energy and climate priorities. All something I think that as a nation, for our energy security and economic security, and as for the globe, we have to. It's a good time to rethink how we address both climate and energy security and bring those together in a very balanced and practical way, because we can achieve both goals without ignoring or taking our eye off the ball, which the crisis in Europe, and I'll try to wrap this up soon because I could talk about this for hours, so apologies. The situation in Europe, a result of many different factors, primarily obviously the invasion of Ukraine, but in the years leading up to this point, when we were in government, we were working with Europeans to increase their energy security and reduce their dependence, which actually grew in recent decades to be the situation where they're importing 40% of their natural gas from Russia, and about to increase it even more with Nord Stream 2. And I think part of that problem is it was the redefinition of energy security, where Europe and other countries, kind of this whole movement, was trying to prioritize climate and add different pieces to the energy security. But at its core, it's about access to affordable, reliable energy. And the last thing is, today it's oil and gas. Tomorrow it's lithium, cobalt, and critical minerals. And we can't take our eye off of, the current reliance on Russia, tomorrow's reliance on China for our critical minerals. Thanks.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that you mention that we have to really first realize that energy is the basis for prosperity and for kind of economic growth. And that's really, I think, the most acute impact of this energy insecurity that Europe and a lot of countries are experiencing right now is it's a lot of consumers are hurting when they fill up their car at the pump, or especially in the UK where my parents live, they're paying ridiculous amounts of money for their electricity bills. But obviously, when it comes to energy security, economic impact is not the only side of that coin. And so, Matt, I'd love to get your thoughts on the intersection of energy security and national security, and specifically what energy independence means for the US and our allies.
Yeah, I mean, look at the fact that some of the world's worst regimes benefit from the sale of relatively dirty fossil fuels, right? Russia, from its oil sales, Iran, same story. Even Venezuela, which has turned in recent decades authoritarian. It's a blight on our hemisphere, and that regime sustains itself still, even under sanctions, through sales of oil. That's one aspect of it. That's a national security consideration for us. We should want these regimes to not be able to benefit so much from those sales, and we don't want our allies to be dependent on the sales of oil from those same regimes. This was the folly of the German policy of building a pipeline from Russia straight into the heart of Europe, the so-called Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was at least a double whammy, if not a triple whammy, in terms of the damage it does to our collective national security, the security of the democracies of the West. It created the chance for a profit windfall for Putin's regime. It actually short-circuited, it cut out Ukraine, which had been receiving significant fees from Russia transiting gas across Ukraine. So it cut out Ukraine as a middleman, which was damaging to the Ukrainian economy. And it made the West and Western Europe more dependent on Russia. And we're going to see some of the pain from that dynamic this winter as the Germans begin to cry uncle. Hopefully we can shore them up and prevent them from leading a sort of unraveling of our sanctions posture against Russia for its war in Europe. Similar dynamic in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? Taiwan, as I was mentioning earlier, imports a lot of LNG. They don't have a lot of storage for it, which means that if China were to conduct a blockade, that would be problematic. Taiwan would find rocketing costs for energy. They need huge amounts of energy, not just to sustain their population of 23, 24 million people, but their semiconductor foundries, which are hugely energy intensive. If Taiwan ends up getting attacked, God forbid, and annexed by China, according to Chinese internal manuals, their PLA manuals, they actually talk about the benefit of annexing Taiwan. One of the benefits being that China then is in a position to blockade Japan. So Japan could very easily find itself in a very vulnerable position, particularly if Taiwan were to fall. And I think a lot of this talk about having the ideal energy mix purely from a climate perspective or from a safety perspective is going to run into these realities. And countries like Taiwan, which also is trying to move away from nuclear power, I think is going to need to reverse itself, given the fact that they're facing the extinction of their system from Chinese militarism. Japan potentially facing a similar threat not too far down the line. So yeah, the fact that we have achieved energy independence just in recent decades through technological innovation, it's a classic great American story. We found that we were able to actually replace Saudi Arabia as the world's largest producer using new innovations, horizontal drilling, the fracking, other techniques that produces gas, which is actually significantly cleaner than coal or oil. It has a much lower carbon footprint. It actually should be viewed and embraced as a significant benefit, something that could actually bridge the movement towards so-called green and renewables, green energy and renewables, with something that's actually not bad, right? LNG, and at the same time leverage our energy independence. We don't depend on the Middle East for our energy anymore, and we can actually become a net supplier and exporter of relatively clean fossil fuels in the form of gas to our friends in Europe and in Asia.
Yeah, and it's interesting, but both you and Wells have kind of referred to this problem of climate change and how that's in a way kind of throwing a big hole into our traditional conceptions of energy security, energy independence, because now all of a sudden you have a lot of countries around the world that are committing to tackling climate change, to reducing emissions, to phasing out fossil fuels. And you have examples that are better than others and some examples that are really pretty bad. And like what we're seeing in Europe right now is that some countries like Germany have really approached this energy transition the wrong way. Lolita, I would love to get your thoughts on your experience in climate diplomacy and the private sector, and just talking about this energy transition. Like, why is it important, but also what are the pitfalls that we should be avoiding?
So prioritizing the energy transition in both legislation and private sector investments is going to be vital to have happen together to mitigate climate change. You may know that during COP26 last year, there was something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So something like 450 companies committed to expending $130 trillion. They all are capitalized $130 trillion. They're spending part of their capitalization on this. But what happens? How does that happen? How does the private sector come together with the public sector to do this? And I think that's the challenge that's coming up in this realm. And I actually work for a firm. Actually, it was $2.5 billion now. So that was my bio when I came on. That's how fast we've grown. It's like the Wild West, unfortunately, but there's a lot of activity and a lot of things that can be done as private sector solutions to be helpful. Energy usage accounts for approximately 72% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And in the US, 79% is from fossil fuels. We're very far from renewable replacing lots of that power right now. So transitioning to cleaner and renewable sources of energy is really vital to reducing that number. And one of the biggest pitfalls to avoid is focusing only on centralized supply side solutions, meaning adding just clean and renewable energy to the grid and adding more power. And it's a problem for a couple of reasons. The first is that utility scale renewable energy plants take a long time to build, in particular in the US, due to permitting issues, community pushback, I don't want it near me, and more. So while they will be important to displacing fossil fuel usage, we also need immediate solutions. And the US has one operational offshore wind farm. Most people don't know that. There's a lot in the pipeline. People are talking a lot about it. But there's one off the coast of Block Island that was facilitated by a friend of mine and Matt's named Stephen Pryor. We are incredibly inefficient in the way that we use energy, leading to higher energy demand. So 66% of energy is wasted between transmission and distribution. By the time it gets to your house, 66% is in the ether, waste heat. That's even when you're riding the subway, it's hot in the subway platform because that heat's getting wasted. So by focusing on energy efficiency solutions, we can decrease that energy demand while also strengthening the grid. And in the time frame necessary to get to net zero, we'll still need to utilize natural gas. I agree with everything all of you have said. Getting rid of some forms of gas is lunacy as well as nuclear. I know that's a really strong word, but I just can't imagine. In New York State, for example, we've canceled Indian Point. We've also have these very aggressive climate goals. I worked in the mayor's office. It's going to be hard for us to get there without Indian Point still being back online. That's Lolita talking. And the last thing I'll say is my company, STCL, owns the gas grid for the city of Stockholm, Sweden, where we turn biogas, waste gas from people into fuel for buses and cooking in homes. So there is a transitional place to utilize cleaner fuels such as these. And it's a tack that countries like Germany need to consider more fully. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how it's difficult, especially in the US with a lot of the permitting issues, to really move to a clean energy future quickly. But it's not just difficult, it's also expensive in many ways, and it requires a lot of investment. And you have skeptics of these international climate change agreements and clean energy initiatives in the US that argue that it doesn't matter if the US and the West invests in clean energy if you don't have major polluters like China and India also investing in this. So how would you respond to people that are saying those kinds of things?
Well, it's interesting. Now I can put my climate diplomat hat on and take off the private sector hat. So I was the climate diplomat for New York City. And what that means is that I've talked to a lot of people around the world trying to solve climate. And one of the things that people don't realize is that networks like C40 Cities, which is the major global mayors around the world, they bring together cities to work on these items, and they've been doing so for some time. So believe it or not, there's cities in China and India who have been acting entirely independently from their national governments, particularly in China, because bad air, as Matt will tell you, bad air quality can be a basis for an arrest. And the last thing they want is people protesting, they get pulled back by the party. Shenzhen decided a few years ago it was critical to electrify their public transportation, and they did it in 1 year. So now there are 10,000 electric buses and all their taxis are electric. It was the first city in the world to do that. They did that completely independently from the federal government. And so all of that was quietly happening. And we realized that a lot of cities realized we needed to see what they were doing, because they're starting to independently get ahead of us on some of these things. So just know that in some of these countries, there are actually independent things happening. But that being said, the Western and non-communist countries are actually banding together to talk about how we can have some of these solutions be shared, have them to scale. And as I said, I can tell you that it's not the case that there's no local action happening. I hosted visits from many global cities, provinces, and regions where the national governments may have even been hostile to action on climate, but the localities were faced with hurricanes, with drought, with extreme heat. There's going to be wars about drought and water. We know this. You look at the damming of the Nile up here, and places in the Middle East are going to be fighting about water. I saw an article in this paper the other day about seed clouds happening, and one country said, you're taking our water because you're seeding the clouds elsewhere. You're going to see a lot more about that. Cloudburst, downpours, fires, poor air quality, and other calamities that really necessitate immediate action by whoever's in power now, because they will not be in power for years from now. So, and a good example of this, whether it's a conservative or liberal local leaders, doesn't matter. The state of Florida, because they're on the front lines, Miami Beach and all that area, they're on the front lines. So the Republicans, the Democrats, everybody is working together. Same with Louisiana after Hurricane Sandy. So I think these climate shocks that are happening are waking people up. So even if the national folks who are 3 or 4 levels removed, like, I'm not sure if I want to do this, a lot is happening on the local line. And I'll leave you with this. 25% of global climate commitments can be met solely by local and regional government, even if the national level actually didn't happen at all on any national level. So just people need to understand there's a lot of the devolution of powers that can happen in this. So don't despair.
That's a good message. Well, some of the Western states in the U.S. might be fighting about water soon as well. It's getting pretty bad out there. But I want to return to China in a second. But first, all three of you have mentioned nuclear energy. And obviously, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, a lot of countries turned against nuclear. That was the basis for Japan denuclearizing, but also Germany, and a lot of what's happening right now in Europe can in a way be traced back to this anti-nuclear movement that swept the globe. But right now, many countries are being forced to kind of reconsider nuclear because of all the issues that we've talked about today. And so I'd love to maybe get all three of you, just get your thoughts on the importance of nuclear energy in this discussion, but also what you see the role of nuclear being and how countries might move towards it.
I'll start since I was just talking. So this is an interesting question for me because Matt and I are both fellows of something called the U.S.-Japan Leadership Program, and our second delegate year was 3 months or 4 months after 3/11. So we were in the country to hear these things firsthand, to see, the lights were dim. It was hot as heck in the buildings because they had the thermostat up to above 80. So we saw some of these things close by. Some had lobbied to try to turn away from nuclear entirely. One of our close friends had done that. However, many felt it would not be feasible to go off completely in the short and intermediate term. So there's still fights about that now. The 2014 annual report on energy showed that Japan depended on imported fossil fuels for 88% of its electricity in 2013, and that number was only 62% in 2010. So without significant nuclear power, the country was self-sufficient for just 6% of its energy demand, which is really not sustainable and it's very alarming for them because they're dependent on everyone else to be able to power the country. Germany, until March 2011, obtained 1/4 of its electricity from nuclear, including 17 reactors. But post-Fukushima, in addition to political pressures, nuclear power was planned to be phased out by 2022, which is now. But following Russia's invasion, obviously they had to change their plans, and they've been signaling this phase out will likely be delayed. So at the end of July, Germany said it plans to leave their last 3 nuclear reactors running this winter, but the newest Minister of Environment is from the Green Party, which has a platform of getting rid of nuclear entirely. So in August, they turned down a proposal to extend the operation of those plants an extra year to 2024. So there's going to be deep inter-party divisions about this, and it may be hard to keep everybody aligned to Germany's detriment. Angela Merkel made that deal to get more and more power from Russia, and they're still going to be dealing with this for some time, trying to extricate itself. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some EU stats. The EU depends on nuclear for 1/4 of its electricity, but half of that is from France. So there's 56 units operating in 3 non-EU countries as well, obviously Russia, Ukraine, and Switzerland, and they account for about 15 to 20% of the electricity in the rest of Europe. So nuclear, I think, in some, for me, really shouldn't go anywhere. If countries were smart, they would keep it because it's a way to get some independence from some of the things that Matt was talking about earlier. I'll just stop there, but I wanted to go first with some foundational stats.
No, I agree with Lolita. Green parties around the world should be embracing nuclear because it is carbon neutral. It is a lot safer today than it was, decades ago, or when you had the Soviet-built Chernobyl reactor, which was the worst nuclear disaster. That's not how they're built anymore. You've got, as Wells was talking about, these small modular nuclear reactors. There's been incredible innovation on that front. These are small, like 300 megawatt reactors that you bury in the ground. You can add additional ones over time if a population grows, if their energy needs grow. That's why it's called modular. You can add or subtract. You can actually move these reactors to where they're needed in the country. The nuclear waste disposal issue. The physicist Richard Muller at UC Berkeley has done a lot of very enterprising work. This thing is solvable. It's easily. There's already plans for how to deal with nuclear waste, by the way, including using some of the innovative fracking and drilling, horizontal drilling technologies that we have. You can deposit nuclear waste, way under the surface of the earth, well below water tables and things like that, where people don't have to worry about radiation leaking. But this is one of those ones that it's two birds with one stone. With nuclear, you can actually enhance your energy independence and energy security, as well as achieving climate goals to reduce carbon. So if we move away from thinking of climate action as sort of a quasi-religious ideology, and instead, treat it the way engineers should treat any problem. Lolita's an engineer, so she knows what I'm talking about. It's a practical problem to be mitigated, right? And with good, smart policies and with innovation. That's the American way of dealing with these things. And it's what we should be doing. Look, Fukushima, the real catastrophe, of course, was the tsunami and the earthquake that created the tsunami that killed almost 20,000 of our Japanese brothers and sisters. The number of people who were killed by radiation from Fukushima, I've seen various estimates, but it's probably in the ballpark of 100 people. To put that into perspective, the United States was losing 40 times that many people per day at the height of COVID last year. So no one's talking about ending biological research, although maybe we should be doing some things to restrict what some of these Chinese labs have been up to, in case, as I think it may well have leaked from a Chinese lab, this virus, or if it turns out that it came from a natural origin through a wild animal market. No one's talking about shutting down, China's whole food chain. They seem to be really stuck on wild meats still. So we need to think in perspective about the safety and danger from nuclear. I think that these fears and dangers are inflated in the public consciousness and in the media in ways that are no longer warranted.
Wells, did you want to add anything?
I agree with Matt and Lolita. Personally, I think it's an exciting time for nuclear. It's not, I think some people, it's not as covered in the press, or once you kind of get below the level, the civil nuclear energy, a lot of, if you're not an engineer, I'm not, people kind of glaze over. But there's a lot of new technologies in development coming down. We see TerraPower, NuScale, which just went public, which has got their NRC license, X Energy, all these new U.S. companies also that developing these small modular advanced reactors. They're safer, more affordable, can produce less waste. I think that's really, if for a pragmatic solution for climate, if some of the climate activists, if that was it, zero emission, we would be all in on nuclear. I think there's a role for all energy sources and technologies, but if that would be probably the core solution, if that was for some the ultimate goal. But I think it's a very exciting time, and we've also seen a lot more bipartisan support in the U.S. for nuclear energy. The Democrat Party changed their platform, I guess it was in 2020, to add nuclear as an acceptable energy. They had been against it. And there's also a direct connection to national security, and that I think a lot, this helping broaden the support base. One other thing, just from emissions reductions, kind of in the future, we talked a little bit about the U.S. emissions, advanced economies, but the large emissions growth projected in the future is going to come from developing nations, where SMRs, microreactors could provide a solution to provide emission-free energy, and not a complete reliance on solar panels that won't power these economies and allow them to grow and develop.
Just a quick thing to add to that. Imagine if everybody in India decided they wanted an air conditioner.
That's a lot of electricity.
Yes.
Look, India would be a good candidate for a country that we should help with some of this fracking technology, right? I mean, if we shifted India from coal to natural gas, you've just taken a massive bite out of the overall carbon emissions footprint. China has the technology to do fracking. They choose not to do it, probably because some of their big state-owned energy companies are really happy with the profits they're making selling oil. But look, India and China, there are ways to get to less polluting sources of energy that they have under their soil that could actually help contribute to the overall reduction of emissions.
Well, and there's, from a national security perspective, there's also a big role there for American LNG, that we can be supplying some of these countries and exporting our LNG to them, which will help our economy because we're exporting it. It will help our national security because we develop those ties, and they'll reduce emissions because you can get them to move from coal to natural gas, which is how the US reduced more emissions than the next 10 countries combined since 2014. But so we've talked, different people have mentioned China, and so I do want to return to that. Before I do that, just quickly reminding people that we'll be going to Q&A soon, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But on China, obviously one of the worrying features of this clean energy transition is that a lot of the technologies and materials, from critical minerals to solar panels to all kinds of other critical components of these clean energy technologies, are being made in China. And a lot of countries around the world, including the US, really rely on China to do this. And Matt, you spent 7 years reporting in China. You've worked on China policy while you were at the National Security Council. What are your thoughts about China's dominance in these areas, and what threat does this pose not only to US national security, but also to this clean energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a step back and look at China, is by far the largest greenhouse gases emitter. I mean, we are distant second. India catching up fast with us, but still just a fraction of what China emits. I see very little evidence that China is pursuing a serious effort to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions. What they are doing is jumping on the opportunity to subsidize and ultimately monopolize batteries, electric vehicles, and some of the other technologies that we are now subsidizing in the United States, and through policies really trying to require Americans to adopt. And so what China is doing is not trying to reduce emissions. What they're trying to do is acquire leverage over the United States and other free markets, free economies that are choosing to shift towards battery, heavy use of batteries and EVs. So it's an irony. What we're on the verge of doing is, having just achieved energy independence through the fruits of our own sweat equity and innovation, so that we're no longer dependent on the Middle East, where we had to fight numerous wars in order to ensure a secure pipeline of energy from the Middle East. Now we've achieved that energy independence, and we're about to give it up again, or a significant part of it, by making China the key critical supplier of inputs into our supply chain. And that's why China is jumping on this. If you look at the speeches of Xi Jinping in 2020, if you look at his 14th five-year plan that he unveiled in March of 2021, he says quite explicitly that his goal is to make China independent of high-tech inputs from industrialized Western economies, and in a jujitsu move, to make those same Western economies wholly dependent on China for their high-tech inputs, including EVs and some of these renewables, some of the things that go into these renewable and electric vehicle supply chains. And he says that it's for a very explicit reason. He wants to increase China's coercive leverage so that it can coerce Western economies for Chinese political reasons. So why would we hand that over? We have to take this into account if we're going to continue down this road of trying to push a really dramatic shift to an electric vehicle economy.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that people do seem to be getting aware of this problem of reliance on China. And obviously recently Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to block imports with ties to forced labor in Xinjiang. And obviously those are solar panels that are being built with slave labor. How do you think that has affected US national security, and how can we kind of move beyond relying on imported solar panels from countries with slave labor to developing those supply chains ourselves? And
Yeah,
Matt, you can start with
I'm
that.
glad you mentioned that. I mean, that's a very important law passed with an overwhelming veto-proof majority by both parties of Congress that basically said we don't want slaves providing critical inputs to our economy. It's unacceptable. That law was resisted by the Biden administration. President Biden had to sign it because it was a veto-proof majority. But we need to. This is a really critical one to watch. You know, is this thing going to be implemented wholeheartedly? Is the Customs and Border Patrol component of our Department of Homeland Security going to be adequately resourced, given what they need to gather intelligence and to have the common operating picture that would let them actually shut down China's export of slave-built solar panels, because you know it's a moral outrage if we start putting this shift towards renewables on the backs of people who are being persecuted, enslaved, and destroyed through policies of genocide in Northwest China.
Or cobalt from child labor in the Congo and things like that. I think there's some humanitarian implications there that we tend to overlook and need to be thought about more. Lolita and Wells, did you have anything to add specifically on the China angle? Go for it, Lolita.
I know. Sorry, I have to mute. Yes, I just wanted to delve a little bit more deeply, really quickly on the EV situation, because as we know, there's now legislation afoot and monies out there to have a lot of chargers, encouraging the EV vehicle market, but a lot of that domestic production will be slowed down dramatically if we don't figure out the rare earth mineral issue. So China currently controls 80% of global output and of processed rare earth metals, as well as 80% of all US imports, as we were alluding to earlier. The US issue is not access to the concentrate in the ground, but rather the processing that China systematically decided that they wanted to dominate and figure out their own supply chain to do that. It's difficult and expensive to process the rare earths. So they made it a supply chain, a strategic national priority, as Matt's saying, and we didn't until recently. So DOD, I looked this up, so this is not from off the top of my head. DOD has now offered tens of millions of dollars in grants to help bring that processing capacity, some of it to the US. And DOE is funding research to make separating the rare earths easier and more efficient. And obviously several private sector companies are heavily investing in onshoring that supply chain as well. So there may need to be more incentives put in place to encourage that US rare earth processing, and for more of the government to really to hone in on that, because if it's not addressed expeditiously, it will impact severely the ability to make a large amount of EVs at scale in the United States.
Well, is anything else?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of our biggest threats to future energy security, economic prosperity, defense, everything. We've gone through the arable embargo in the 70s and kind of the fossil fuel reliance, broken free of that, and now we're current policy in the United States is let's put away our fossil fuels that have given us energy independence and pursue completely renewable solar, wind, again, EVs that rely on these minerals and processing that China controls. It's no coincidence, and Matt can talk about this and knows this very well, that this is a playbook from Russia's control of energy, its grip in Europe, and China's been open about it, as Matt laid out. And this is something that we need to really have. For me, it's a defining moment, similar to the 70s and the International Energy Agency, but for bipartisan support, global kind of coming together to say, how are we going to solve the energy security issue, but also support reducing emissions and climate goals, these have to be done together. And it can't be done with talking points or pop-up programs. It needs to be a very pragmatic and balanced approach.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a good question here from the Q&A, which I think, Lolita, you'd be well placed to answer. I won't read the whole thing, but the gist of it basically is kind of what is the evidence that fossil fuel combustion will kind of has an impact on climate change? And I think kind of extending that within the realm of what we're talking about today, how does that also impact our national security? Because obviously there are elements of climate change, like you mentioned, drought and other impacts that will have an effect on the United States. So could you quickly talk about that, Lolita?
Well, since I've been out of the loop a little bit on what's happening on the governmental level, I can say during the time that I was in New York City Mayor's office, absolutely there were people studying this. The IPCC, New York City even had its own New York City panel on climate change. Also, a lot of people are doing this research to think about divestment from fossil fuels. So there's quite a bit of a body of research out there done to see what would happen if we actually continued at the rate that we are now, burning the fossil fuels. So I can't point to specific studies, but I can tell you there's a lot out there. Certainly there are people who disagree, but you also even just look at what's happening now in our climate. The fact that it's the hottest it's ever been in the UK, that's solely due to human-powered climate change. So if we continue to go, that's just going to get worse. There's going to be places people can't live. There's going to be food that can't be grown. COP27 in a few months, watch out for that. As we know that Egypt subsidizes their bread, and their bread and their wheat comes from the Ukraine and Russia. So if they start to get bread riots because they can't actually subsidize that anymore, I'm not sure you want to show up at COP. That's just Lolita talking, but that's real. So all that continues to happen if we continue to burn at the rate that we're doing. Matt, I'm sure you want to say something.
No. Yeah, I appreciate Fred's question. First of all, I appreciate his skepticism, just having a skeptical but open mind. Since we have seen cases where so-called consensuses were announced in science by scientific elites that have turned out to be wrong or questionable. I mentioned before, just COVID, right? I mean, it was announced by panels of scientists early in the pandemic that it had to absolutely full stop come from a natural origin. We now know that an equally viable, if not more viable, possibility is that the virus was accidentally leaked following very dangerous gain-of-function research that was taking place in China that we know about. We know about that very dangerous research. So I think it's good to be skeptical, but also to maintain an open mind. I'm not a climate scientist either. I'll tell you that one report that's worth looking at, it had a big impact on my own views about global warming, was by the same scientist, the physicist I mentioned a few minutes ago, Richard Muller. Richard Muller, while he, in his time at UC Berkeley, he was actually a skeptic of climate change and undertook a huge sort of meta study where he brought in leading statisticians, leading thinkers across a range of different disciplines, and did this interdisciplinary look at the problem of climate change to really question all the underlying assumptions. And he came away not only having changed his mind about climate change, but also believed that we were underestimating the impact of human inputs, including the burning of fossil fuels and the impacts that has had in increasing global temperatures. So make your own decision, Fred. I'm just recommending that one report. It influenced my thinking pretty heavily on the question. I do think it's a problem, but all of us have to keep an open mind as we find out, as we get new data and new analysis coming in on this.
Yeah, I'll second the Richard Muller thing. ACC actually has worked with him, and we produced a mini documentary with the Daily Caller, kind of talking about climate change and some of the scientific facts behind that. And Richard Muller featured in it and gave very good thoughts. And he's a conservative himself, so he comes at this from a scientific perspective, but then also someone who's worried about the future of the planet and wanting to protect that. I think also one thing that we should bear in mind is that markets are very clearly moving in the direction of clean energy, of kind of accepting climate change and wanting to do something about it. And one of the crucial points is that the United States should be a part of those conversations, and that we should be accepting that countries are moving in that direction, and we should not just be inactive, but be proactive in trying to be a part of that, and in fact, leading the world on these things. And when it comes to innovation and technology, like Matt said at the beginning, that's what America does best. And so I think that's really something that we should be keeping in mind, not just from a climate perspective, but also from a national security and an energy security perspective. So we are coming up to the last 2 minutes here. I want to give each of our panelists a very quick opportunity to just wrap up with quick thoughts before I thank you all and let you get back to the rest of your days. Let's start maybe with Matt again.
Look, I don't really have anything else to add, but really just to thank you for hosting this, and to thank Wells, my former colleague, and Lolita, my old friend, for joining. Learned a few things from both of you. Thanks.
Awesome. Lolita?
I'll just say the same, that I really appreciate being part of this. And I think that all sectors working together is how the US is going to get there. It's not just the government solution. The private sector is willing to come in and be part of that. And hopefully discussions like this will encourage that and show the urgency with which this needs to happen.
Yeah, no, thanks again for hosting, and great to join the panel. I think, I would just kind of underscore the importance of looking at using and utilizing all energy sources as cleanly and efficiently as possible, and reforming our policies both domestically with permitting, whether it's permitting offshore wind, permitting mines, or permitting oil and gas production as well. We can't close the door on any one source. We need to utilize all of them as clean and efficiently as possible, and balance that economic and national security reality while also protecting our environment, which the U.S. has led the world in doing, and will continue to do so.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of the Vandenberg Coalition and the American Conservation Coalition, thank you, Lolita, Matt, and Wells, for your time today and your excellent insights. I think from our perspective, if there's anything that people watching this would take away from today, is that energy security, national security, and climate change are interrelated issues, and we have to be able to tackle all three at the same time without sacrificing one for the other. So thank you again for your thoughts. They really were very insightful, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of things for us to continue to be on the loop on and work with. But thank everyone for your time, and have a great rest of your weeks.